Okay. As far as I can tell, I'm recording. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Yep, I can hear.
Okay, off we go. So, um, last time we saw how the Vikings really destroyed Charlemagne's dream, but then came the recovery, and it comes in a very interesting way. Um, uh, the Vikings went on, and we'll see as we go through the history up to the present that the impact was worldwide because the Normans took over England and the British Empire, the sun never set. So we'll keep talking about the Vikings. We are not done at all with the Vikings, and we'll see how the Hundred Years' War was basically a battle between two wings of the Normans who were basically Vikings. All right. So, so much happens that nobody could predict. So I'm going to go to my guru, Yogi Berra. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Um, and so where we're heading is very strong warlords. And we've already seen how the Habsburgs went from a warlord to becoming the primary monarchs of Europe. And Juan Jose, I hope that you had a chance to look at the YouTube and see how the Habsburgs influenced the Spanish royal family, and the whole story of Juana la Loca. So I look forward to hearing your voice again to see what you thought about Juana la Loca, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, so all medieval warlords wanted to strengthen their position as nobility and their authority. They wanted to develop communications and roads. Towns that were popping up wanted safe lanes for trade without constantly being victims of banditos. And of course, they wanted to tax. Now, I'm going to be talking about different elements, and I'm going to go back to something we developed when Juan Jose and Aiko and a couple other people were doing the early years of the human history. And when we got to the end of 4000, we reached 500 AD. We looked back and we said, how was power managed and by whom? And we came up with these six categories. Of course, you start off with the violent men. They're the ones who bring some kind of order and some kind of police function. And then you get some kind of endorsement by an ideology. Usually it's a religion, like it was in Sumer and in Egypt. And the pharaohs based their power on their priests and who kept their people in line and appropriately fearful and loyal through ideas, not just the violence of the police. And then, especially in Sumer, which was located right on the trade routes, you had the development of trade and business and wealth. And I can't ever slack on that because Juan Jose, this is going to be his line of work. But then in China, you had something very interesting happen. Power eventually came to be managed somewhat by the Confucian ethic, which wasn't religion. Now it's sort of evolved, and Confucius is certainly worshipped, but it's basically an ethical system that was based on meritocracy, scholars who were in service of stability. And so they had exams. They've been taking exams for 2,000 years. So we can understand now a little bit the difference that we're seeing in the clash of civilizations between the West and China, a very different system. And you can argue that each dynasty went through a cycle, but it was based on a meritocracy, and you can argue that communism is that. And then what was new and interesting in the Mediterranean was the idea of consent. It didn't start with a democracy and citizens, although Athens, in its brief 100 years, 150 years, had a democracy, but it was a democracy where 25% could vote, women couldn't, and 50% were slaves. So kind of an asterisk there. But Rome had a consent, had a Senate 500 years before the Common Era. And so the category of consent is important in power management. Now, the Roman Empire, which lasted almost 1,000 years, obviously was not always run by consent, and it degenerated into emperors, and we know that story. But the idea was there, and so I'm going to use the blue color when we're diagramming what's going to happen from 500 to 1,500 over that 1,000 years. That blue line is going to come into play. And then always lurking as an important tool in power and helping those that have the power is the science and the technology and the scholars. So you had in Egypt, for instance, you had in Egypt astronomers, and they dazzled the population because they could look at the night sky and they could see the disappearance of Sirius seasonally, a very bright star that, because of the tilt of the Earth, drops below the horizon for 75 days. And when it reappeared, all of a sudden, the Nile flooded. So they had a cosmic calendar. Human calendars just didn't work. They knew it was around 360, but they weren't sure. And 365 and a quarter, no, they never got close to the mathematicians plotting out. It took the astronomers to figure out, and that was tremendously reinforcing to the priests, because it was the priests who, the astronomers were in service to the priests. And the priests said, Pharaoh, the floods are coming next week. And the Pharaoh would go out and make the announcement. So this was one of the early examples of knowledge helping in the management of power, for good or for evil. And we can come down to all the way to the atomic bomb, which we eventually will. So this is how I use these colors to diagram. And I'm going to use Islam because we've done the full arc of Islam just to demonstrate my idea of how to diagram and see what all these 6 elements are doing and how they work together, sometimes in support, sometimes in opposition. But you'll remember Islam, Muhammad was a religious leader, but he was also had control of the army. And so in Islam, these two forces start very high. Also, Muhammad was a trader. So at the very beginning, from the very get-go, he was a caravan driver. And so that was always a priority. And you can look at the first 500 years of Islam as being globalization. Their trading empire went from Spain to Indonesia. They also leveraged knowledge. The Abbasid Golden Age we talked about, the Abbasid Golden Age around 1250. They were the leading in the world in science and medicine, in astronomy and mathematics, Arabic numerals. They stole it from the Indians, but they applied it. No consent. So blue consent. Things are coming from the Quran. They're coming from the religious leaders, and things move along. They suffered. The Arabs did invasions by the Turks. So the Ottomans wiped out the Arabs, and then they reasserted their authority. And it was the Ottomans who ran the ulama. And eventually, over time, the knowledge and the wisdom of their golden age fell. And we saw that. And their trading empire as well fell. And why was that? Well, when we did Islam, you'll remember I quoted from this book, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East didn't. And it was mainly, according to Jared Rubin, who is a interesting multidisciplinary professor at Stanford, who has studied religion and politics and trade. His belief is that the reason, compared to the West, always compared to the West here, because in their own terms, maybe they were perfectly happy where they were, but compared to the West, their power dropped. And it's because the ulama, the religious community, saw the printing press as a threat. And they convinced the political leaders for 250 years to not allow the printing press into their realm. A very interesting theory. I don't know, but of all the stuff I've read, it's kind of interesting. So I'm passing it on, not as truth, but as a hypothesis. So that's Islam. Scientific achievement dropped off, trade dropped off, and so much of it was because of the neglect of knowledge. Now, I want to apply this for the 1,000 years we're going to study, but I'm going to take it in 2 bites. All right, so I'm going to apply this system to the first 500 years, because there's a lot going on in these different realms of power. So just to review, when Rome was overrun by barbarians, what was left, right? All that was left was the Christian church and the bishops. They had the confidence to hang around and just go into the various Roman diocese, which was a Roman organization, and to take those over and say, okay, we're in charge. We're going to be the monitors of civilization. And so, in terms of later on, we're going to hear about the term estates applied to Western Europe. So, religion really was the first estate. We saw that the barbarians came down as warlords and slowly went into league with the Christian church. That's what we talked about last time. And they evolved from warlords into nobles, some which we think of as being highborn, but they weren't originally highborn. So the nobles were the second estate. And today we're going to spend most of our time talking about the third estate, which is the rise of towns. And slowly but surely, collections of prosperous farmers went into villages, and there was a surplus. You've got to have a surplus for a civilization, as we talked about very early, right, Juan Jose? But I can't hear feedback from you. But I know you're nodding your head enthusiastically. And you have to start with trade rules and then ethics and commercial law even. And we'll talk about how commercial law develops, and that is guilds. And then you, with surplus, you get artisans. And sometimes the guilds and the artisans in within the towns are referred to as the fourth estate. I've put down here in very small, later on in the second 500, we'll talk about parliaments and we'll talk about universities, but I'm going to try to keep it simple for now. I haven't forgot about parliaments and I haven't forgot about consent and knowledge. All right. And so we have, starting off, as I said, the religion, the Christian church, the warlords, and they're working together, and they create a form of feudalism. They create a form of feudalism. Not much going on in towns at all. Not much going on in education. But then slowly, as I said, with surplus, folkways develop about how are we going to trade? And what we saw in history in the first 4,000 years is it's almost an instinct for humans to trade. If they've got 3 of something and they only need 2, and another guy has 4 of something and only needs 3, it's mutually beneficial to swap. And so villages they start with rules. And then what happens, and we talk about Rudolf Habsburg now, all of a sudden towns are looking around and they're saying, hey, we need somebody to safeguard the roads over a longer distance. We want to do long distance trading, and our local noble can't guarantee that. So there's an interesting relationship between the development of monarchs and towns. First among equal warlord who has a larger reach and who taxes and can actually come up with a bureaucracy, which I misspelled, I see. I do these things in the middle of the night when I wake up and I see patterns. So here we're getting the notion of the beginning of kingship and towns going into alliance with each other. I'm going to stop there for now. later on, we'll talk about in more detail about the monarch, which mon is one, archus, leader, one leader that the towns wanted to come to power. And eventually we're going to talk about parliaments and consent and the first, second, and third states that are represented in those parliaments and universities. So that's kind of a ground plan. And when we hit 1100, we're going to be talking about the high Middle Ages, when all this comes together and society is hitting on all cylinders. Then, unfortunately, there's not a happy ending to the century before 1500, 2 centuries really. And that's going to be our next lecture. But let's concentrate now on the takeoff of the high Middle Ages. And just as I'm stewing over these things, in this week's Economist appears this book review. And it's about medieval Europe and how it became psychologically peculiar and particularly prosperous. So I don't know about you, but every once in a while, there are some coincidences in your life where you go, that's strange. Why am I getting this book review on the very topic I'm stewing over? So what do they mean by weird? So in the book review, they talk about how medieval commercial law that I was just talking about and folk rules and values created what they call a weird society, meaning Western Europe, educated, we'll be talking about universities, industrialized, and that'll be coming after 1500, obviously, rich and democratic. And they thought, and this is a quote, that in the period that we're looking at in medieval Europe, there was a tough-minded belief in the rule of law, an openness to experimentation, a trust of strangers, which would be new, right? Because when Rome fell, you didn't trust strangers for many centuries. But it somehow emerged in medieval society, and they removed some obstacles to a healthy individualism. And what were they? Well, the influence of the extended family, nepotism. Nepotism is a virtue in places like China, where you have loyalty to the family. We saw on the Navajo reservation a tremendous problem with getting the tribes to become a meritocracy, because they favored their relatives, and that's a virtue. But in medieval society, they somehow reduced the influence of the extended family and nepotism. And one way is the Roman church banned kin marriage, banned cousin marriage. And I'm reading this and I'm saying, wait a minute, the whole story of the Habsburgs is cousin marriage. So this doesn't fit. And if I could meet the author, I'd say, hey, what do you mean? The Habsburgs married cousins like crazy. But he said in general in the society, there was a loosening of the power of the extended family in contrast to China, right? It couldn't be more different. And by the way, at the same time, that's where they came up with the rule of celibacy for priests, and that hasn't worked out too well. So who is this guy? Here he is. He's a Harvard guy, and he's a professor of human evolutionary biology. So he's looking deep, and his data is based on medieval Europe. And what he does is he contrasts it with China, and in particular Afghanistan, where you have the extended family, the tribal. The next step after an extended family is tribalism. Tribalism interfering with the organization of any kind of civilization. So Juan Jose, those are a couple of, that's an example of how the extended family can get in the way of civilization. So let's go on now to the rise of towns in the Middle Ages and give you some pictures. I'm sorry I had to go heavy with diagrams and words, but I wanted to set a roadmap on how we're going to get from the Viking period to 500 and the Renaissance. And a lot of it is, as I've said, is going to involve towns, which provided a tax base for the local warlord or noble or thug. This is a Ramsey slide. And infrastructure that mainly the protection of roads and trade lanes. And so you see the nascent towns, a building, very part of civilization. I'm sure Egypt and Sumer and China, all the development of cities in India had a similar process, but we don't have the records that we have. The West is the youngest of the major civilizations, which meant that they evolved in the time of pretty good record keeping, and in particularly in the time of the printing press a little bit later on. So the other things that helped was warmer weather. So climate, and it created surpluses of both food and population. And the Viking threat had been absorbed, and they, in fact, were no longer. They had become the government. So it was in their interest to have security, and towns paying them taxes. There's no more major wild men coming in. The Vikings was pretty much the last wave. We've said the Hungarians were about the same time, but there weren't too many more coming into Europe. Now, a notable exception are the Mongols, which come pretty close. And the Turks, which get to the walls of Vienna, but basically Western Europe is going to be allowed to progress and develop economically. And the other thing is with the Crusades, the Crusaders also made discoveries about how the rest of the world was living. They saw what was coming off that Silk Road, and they liked it. So when they came back and became the nobles and warlords, they started working more closely with towns. And we're going to see the monarchs in particular work closely with towns to get provide protection and get tax revenue. But towns were suspect. And like today, we have a rural-urban split that I'll show you in just a second in our country. But money grubbers, irreverent, the church saw the temptation, envy. And here we are, the results of the last election, rural versus urban. Juan Jose, the blue areas are the urban areas, and they have, went heavily Democrat. But although rural is only 20% of the population, they cover a disproportionate geographical area for obvious reasons. So the rural urban split is nothing new. And we saw it in the history of Japan. And you can almost argue that it was a reason for Japanese fascism. And you see it in other cultures as well. So the towns were granted liberties, not because people were all of a sudden believing in consent and the Greek democracy or Roman republicanism. They were doing it for taxes. Okay, towns, you can have a certain amount of freedom. And if a serf manages to get to a town and stay there for a year and a day without some bounty hunter finding him and dragging him back to his peasant life, he was allowed to be free, not in the sense of being a citizen, but allowed to live in a town and have certain legal and political rights that were determined by guilds and influential folkways, things that we talked about in the future. The other thing in the past, the other thing the guilds did was spread risk and determine quality. Guilds were not, though, early capitalism. They weren't interested primarily in profit. I think they liked it. They were interested in stability, though. That was their primary goal, was stability. And you see a little bit of that hung over in European capitalism. Okay, Juan Ortiz is coming back, so I'll admit him. He must have left. Welcome back, Juan Ortiz. I hope you can, Juan Jose, I hope you can hear me. But I don't know. I'll take it on faith. You see in European capitalism, the Rhenish capitalism, which is not concerned primarily with short-term profit, but Rhenish capitalism, German capitalism, on the board of companies, you get community leaders. The workers sit on the board. So the labor union, it's called the Mitbestimmungsrecht. And so they're operating more in the sense of a larger community, like the guilds were, if you will. And the women in towns did get a few more rights. We have a friend in Zurich. This is from the 80s when we visited him. And his family was a member of a guild. He had a membership that was inheritable, and his mixed race son will become a guild member in Zurich. So here we are. All of a sudden now towns have taken off, and there's now all these trade routes that go especially thence from Italy up to the Low Countries. And that, you'll remember, was the kingdom of Charlemagne's middle grandson, Lothair. And so we see that here, Mailand, it's not spelled Milano, but Mailand in Lombardy is in the same area and trade route that runs from Italy up to the Low countries. Over here, just to review, is the Holy Roman Empire, which is none of those things, and is kind of shut off by the Alps to the south. And we're going to be, and this was where the Habsburgs emerged from, and it's going to be the major player is going to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And here we have France, just to review, still sitting there. They've been attacked right to the heartland by the Vikings. The Vikings have been given Normandy, and they're going to get greedy and take England. And we talked about that history. And then Norman cousins are going to fight a 100 Years' War for the control of land, which the Normans in England thought still belonged to them, but their cousins, their Norman cousins in France said no. And this is a very different cultural area. We talked about this early on. It borders on the Rhine, and it was much different. It took over more the Latin Roman habits, whereas to the east of the Rhine, where the Germanic barbarians had more of an influence. But we saw this is where Charlemagne came from, and one of his grandsons continued to rule this area. So it's absolutely distinct. But as we get into the interesting stories of the French nation and the English nation, we just need to bear this in mind, how different they are from between each other because of this Latin influence, even though they're Norman cousins. And then off goes the trade. So Juan Jose, trade really takes hold of Western Europe and creates enormous wealth. This is in the Low Countries, in Belgium. They specialized in fabric and wool that they imported from England. And the other end is Italy. And when you saw on those trade routes, there were eastern routes around the Alps where trade could happen. It wasn't easy. And we saw when we looked at the Habsburgs, the problem getting over the Alps directly from Milan, Milano to Switzerland. But it became possible with the building of bridges and engineering. And reaching a peak, this is 1336. This is just about the time the Black Plague hits. And that's part of the sad ending to this period that I hinted at. And that we'll look at probably next week. And at this point, when you have long distance trading, you need some kind of credit. You need trust. Now, Muslims, they were good on trust because they were dealing with other religious true believers. All along that from Spain to Indonesia, you had trust, religious trust, and you had a pretty ethical system, which if you remember the five tenets One is giving alms to the poor, and they have a strong element of equality in their basic tenets. And I didn't mention it when I talked about how the power of Muslims sank relative to the West. But that might have held them back a little bit from capitalism. But between the Low Countries and Italy, if you're going to trade money, you've got to develop some kind of banking system. And at both ends of that route, you get Italian banks, and then you get Dutch banks. And where does the word bank come from? It just meant bench. It's where money lenders went to sit. Now, this is overcoming in the West, in the Mediterranean, a prejudice against tradesmen, against business. And we're considering the Holy Land as part of the Mediterranean, and you can see the low status of money lenders here. But it was equally true in China. Businessmen were held in low repute. And it was true of the Mediterranean. But this was one of this was overcome by this new civilization that was a building in medieval times. Interestingly, the Middle East and India, businessmen have high status. And why might that be? Because they're in the middle, they're the crossroads. We saw that with when we contrasted Sumeria with Egypt, 3,000 years BCE, that Sumer was much more mercantile and had caravans way before Egypt did. Ecumen, a fancy word, it just means inhabited land. So this was in Roman times the ecumen, inhabited land that didn't get all the way to India. And this is the ecumen in the Middle Ages. So you see the Silk Road connecting finally China with the western end of the ecumen. Now, credit, this slide comes from a history of the Jews. And the same reason that the Muslims had credit with each other and could establish long distance trading, so could Jews. And in their world, the prejudice against business and profit didn't operate. And I'm guessing that usury is a New Testament thing, but in any case, if it isn't, they ignored it because they realized, as Juan Jose has already discovered, that all money is a medium for people to state their preferences. That's all. And the Jewish community from the diaspora had spread out and had maintained, because of their insular feeling about and the strength of their religion, had maintained distant contacts, if not directly with family, at least other people. Now, there were some families, and famously in more modern times, the Rothschilds had 5 brothers, and one brother was in London, one brother was in Paris, one brother was in Frankfurt, where they came from. One brother, I think, was in Italy. I'm not sure where the other, maybe he was in, the fifth one was in Spain. So trust, credit, that psychological state is so important to doing business. In the West, we manage it through lawyers when we don't have trust with elaborate contracts. But in Asia, no, not so much, not so much. But the being of the same religion we see in both Muslims and Jews helped an awful lot in the development. And this is the Jews from Spain starting to help with the flow of money over long distances. You'll remember the Arabs and the Jews got along just fine in Spain, just fine, as did the Turks and the Ottomans with the Jews for the most part. The Jewish population in Cordoba was 5% of the population, so they prospered, and they played a role very early in the flow of money for very good reasons, because money is just votes for what preference, for what people prefer. Eventually you get the Hanseatic League. So you get the tie-in between these city-states, and they're city-states. They're not nations yet. This is the Holy Roman Empire, Hanseatic League, but they have links all over the place, all the way to Krakow, throughout the Baltic area, all the way up to Edinburgh, and down through the Mediterranean to Genoa, and to Venice. So because I've had problems with my screen, I'm not able to see what time it is. Aiko, I need somebody tell me what time it is.
Hi, it's 11:58, John.
Okay, I'll try to wrap this up in 5 minutes.
Thank you. This is fabulous.
Thank you. City-states, I just got to throw this in. This is from Thomas Friedman, who says, if you're getting upset about the America and where we're going, just stand on your head. That got my attention, because locally, mayors are cooperating and doing a lot of things on the ground in American cities. And then just this week, this is Ben Sass, who took a strong stand against Trump before the election. Once he could no longer be primaried, he finally got a backbone. He's a senator, for Republican senator from Nebraska, Juan Jose, and he basically talks about civil society, which is what de Tocqueville said about America. That we have a very strong civil society, civic society. 86%, Sass is saying 86%, politics isn't the center of their life. Neighborhoods and towns are the center of their life. So city-states, towns, the Holy Roman Empire, they never organized into a nation. Well, but when they did organize to a nation, Germany, not such great things happened. Maybe it had been better if they'd stayed city-states. But here we are back in the towns in medieval time. And this is just a review of what this new book review said, that individualism was strong, materialism, free thinking, hardworking, disciplined. Yeah, but spiritually insecure, fair enough. But living on credit, that people trusted each other long distance with the exchange of money and goods. This is one of the most famous bankers, a French banker, who helped get Henry V from England out of France with Joan of Arc. He had a very sad story, but I don't have time for that today. And then the envy of the towns became a virtue. All of a sudden, being prosperous was a good thing. And a civilization that appreciated artisans and the work of artisans, also a very important part of civilization, Juan Jose. The fine things, what artisans can do, the people that don't have to work in the fields, you got enough surplus that people can create beauty. And not just material things, but music and instruments. And then education. I am going to stop here and give 2 minutes for another little proposed project. Let me see if I can get to it. Has everybody got a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I
So-
wondered about that guy in the blue robe that's like holding his head in the right hand lower corner.
Let's see where we are here. Okay. You recognize where this place is? I put in a clue.
We're in Lafayette.
Yeah. So I walked around on this plaza a long time, and I didn't even see that was Lafayette. Lafayette, Juan Jose, was a Frenchman who came over and helped our founding fathers rebel against the British. And he's a main character in this hit musical Hamilton, Juan Jose, which if you want to understand America and our founding beliefs, which is important for a civilization to have, I think it's best summed up with Hamilton in the most diverse way it can be, where Jefferson, who said all men were created equal and had slaves, is mocked in the play. And I think that's the way to handle the problems with our founding fathers, not throw out what they did, but to criticize them in creative ways. So this leads me into something that happened over the weekend. This is my son and Aiko's and my
Oh yeah, in front of Garfield.
in front of Garfield. And so I got a text, "Who's Garfield?"
Oh no.
And so we spent a time texting back and forth.
They knew who Garfield. They didn't know why he was there.
Okay.
Oh yeah, he was
Uh,
killed.
First, they know who Garfield is.
Okay, good.
I misspoke. And so why is he there? And so he is Juan Jose. This is one of the largest monuments in Golden Gate Park. And it's to a president. He was a general in the Civil War, fair enough. But his presidency, which was heading in the right direction, he was all in favor of civil service reform and getting rid of corruption. We're talking about the 1880s. And there was a guy
who wanted a job, who had worked really hard on the Garfield election. And he thought that he'd worked hard enough to become even the United States ambassador to France. And when he wasn't given any job at all, he assassinated Garfield. And the reason it's here is that assassination coincided with the finishing of the Golden Gate Park. So we don't have any monuments in this park. And at that point, they thought Garfield was going to go down in history as one of the greatest presidents. And so they put up this huge statue. And here's where it is in Golden Gate Park. If any of you want to pay homage to Garfield, it's on a very prominent place, right in the center, near a lot of other prominent things. So I've walked by it a number of times. I don't think just like Lafayette's statue, I don't think I noticed it. And here are my grandsons with Columbia. This Columbia was our go-to feminine deity before the Statue of Liberty. She kind of faded with the Statue of Liberty, but this is Columbia, and you go back into the time of the Revolution, and there are posters with Columbia, the American Revolution. And so that's where I'm going to stop. And what I'd like to suggest is at some point, if the group is interested, I'd like for you all to come up with examples of historical markers in your area. That or in any area that you found significant, like I found significant with these two examples, and share them. I don't have to do all the talking all the time. And I was thinking, since next week is the last session before Thanksgiving, we might devote half of the time, if people are interested, to sharing any connections with local history. The thing I like about history, Juan Jose, and I know you've heard me say this, is just the connection with the stories of the past and what happened on the land that you're standing on, or the land that you've walked through. Juan Jose, I just got a chat. He said, let's do that. So we'll expect to see something from Columbia. I was thinking about, I didn't have time, about throwing up the famous little bridge. It's a tiny little bridge that Simon Bolivar captured inside Colombia. He spent as much time in Colombia as he did in Venezuela. I'll run. I obviously took photos of that bridge, where an epic battle took place against the brutal Spaniards. You know, that was their Bunker Hill. That was their Lexington and Concord. Okay, so I think that's been an hour. Any questions?
Just a comment. I think Rob and I can do. We've been noticing since the monument teardowns, we are particularly noticing monuments as well, and so we can do probably a couple of them from Golden Gate Park. You know, be really fun.
Okay, good. And
you already stole Garfield, though.
What?
You already stole Garfield, because that's where I meet my sister after an earthquake.
Cool. Yeah, we have earthquakes here, Juan Jose. So you got to know where to meet your wife after an earthquake, or your or significant people. So, and Juan Jose's already indicated he's thumbs up. So we'll look forward to historical markers around Bogota and out into the countryside if you want. And all right, that's enough of a thumbs up. That's what we'll do for half of the period. Okay.
Fabulous, fabulous. I have to run, but John, thank you so much. This is just so helpful, especially now my brain pings back and forth between what's happening in the news right now and all that you're talking about. It's really, really helpful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I gotta go. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
So, John, this is Carol. I
Yeah.
want to know, why did the Vikings stop raiding? It seemed like such a good idea. They didn't have to farm. They would just like try and take things.
So the answer is that they did continue raiding for a long time. So once in feudal society, raids against other warlords continued for centuries. So a feudal society after the Vikings was not stable in any way, shape, or form. So they did, and it took an awful long time for the nation state to develop. But the Vikings from north stopped raiding because there'd been a like a brain drain, right? Yeah, the most violent people had left. The most risk taking people had left, and then the Vikings settled down and became over time more refined. They could tax the towns and buy all that swell stuff that the artisans were making, and they became domesticated. We're gonna see that the conflict between the monarchs that are slowly developing, the strongest of the warlords who go into the alliance with towns, and that's going to be that conflict, that tension is going to go on, and the Magna Carta, which we celebrate, was merely an agreement between the lesser warlords and the top warlord, who by that time was King John, who was from the Normans, Plantagenet, and the warlords around were all Normans. To our shock, when we went to Scotland, and you know about Robert the Bruce, who was their great liberator, Juan Jose, he was Norman. So the spat between Scotland and England was just a spat between descendants of Normans over land that they were going to control. It had nothing to do with any kind of intrinsic character of Scotland. And so the long answer is that it took, they didn't stop. It was just easier now that they had land and peasants to get their sustenance from taxes without having to get in boats and go some other place. But they did keep raiding each other because that's they were the worst of the worst in terms of violent prone men, and we're going to see how you can make an argument that they're still influencing the world. You can make an argument that they were part of that spirit was part of colonialism, because you had France and England who were heavy in Norman absorption leading the colonial charge. Germany was relatively late to the game.
We could say the same thing with China. I mean, you know, they kept getting invaded. They even had to build a wall, but then pretty soon their invaders decided, hey, this Chinese emperor is living pretty well. I think I'll settle down and become the ruler.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll see a little bit later. It probably will still be within this calendar year. The history of Russia and how they finally turned off the tap of wild men coming down from the steppes. But that's an interesting story that involves Genghis Khan and the Mongols and
Oh,
Russia. So we'll look forward to that interesting story.
so how did the Vikings count? How do they decide how to tax? I mean, did they? So like there was the Figures book in England where they counted. They knew how many people they had and how much property they had. They did that in Japan. They had somebody do that. I forget what century, but how did the Vikings do that?
Well, the Domesday Book in England was ordered by William the Conqueror, who was a Norman, who was just one step removed from being a Viking. Smaller areas in feudal times, the relationship between the local noble and the townspeople. It was a trade. We call it taxes now, but it was really a trade, right? It was a protection racket. I'll protect you.
Right. Okay.
It's a nice story you got there. Be ashamed if something happened to it. So it was a protection racket, basically. I can't say it any more simply than that.
So it's not really taxation the way I think of it. It's much easier to think of it as the mafia.
Well, that's what it was closer to that than what taxes mean to us now. Although security is a big part of the deal you make with the nation state. So.
Right. This is so great, John. Thank you. It's really tying a lot of things together.
All right. Okay. If there's no other questions, any other questions? All right. So see you next week. We'll do half, try to finish the development of towns, and half personal stories about how history has surrounds the areas that you live in.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Okay. Juan Jose says, thanks, everybody. Take care.